Today's lesson is going to be on converting between fractions, decimals, and percents in your notes packet. Up at the top here, we have a nice little chart that goes through all the steps. If we're writing fractions as decimals, fractions as percents, decimals as fractions, decimals as percents, percents as fractions, percents as decimals. These all work and are the very basic skills, the very basic methods of how to do it. For our purposes today, we're going to be utilizing the calculator. And if you remember, when we type in using the fraction button, we can actually change to decimals. If we type in decimals, we can actually use the fraction button to go back to fractions. From there, we're going to use a guy called Decimal Percent Man, who's going to kind of help us remember changing between decimals and percentages then. So I'm going to start down here at the table. If I start with the fraction 3/8 and I type that into my calculator, go ahead, hit equals, and then hit the fraction button one more time. It changes it over to the decimal for me, 0.375. From here, I can go from a decimal to a percent pretty easily. I'm going to have to move my decimal point 2 places to the right, okay? So I'm going to take my decimal point, 0.375, and I'm going to move it 2 spots to the right, which now puts it between the 7 and the 5. So that tells me that this is 37.5%. You need to write down the percent symbol with it. The next one is missing the fraction but has the decimal. So on your calculator, type in 0.25, hit enter, equals, and then go ahead, hit the fraction button. It changes it over to 1/4. So in our table, we'll fill in 1/4. To go from a decimal to a percent, move the decimal point 2 places to the right, which moves it to the end after the 5, so 25%. The next one, we have 1/10. Go ahead, type that in using your calculator. So you have 1/10. Hit the fraction button again. 0.1 is our decimal. And if we were to take 0.1 and move the decimal point 2 places over, it's now here, but we have an empty spot to fill in, and we're going to have to fill that in with the 0. So this is 10%. I wouldn't write 10%. That would just be weird. The last one is 90%. So for me to go back to a decimal, I move it 2 places to the left. On a 90, the decimal point is at the end because it's a whole number. Move it 2 places to the left. It's now in front of the 9. So 0.9, I don't have to write the extra 0. 0.9 I could type into my calculator, hit the fraction button, and I get 9/10. Or I could realize that if I read that to myself, I would have 0 and 9/10. That actually tells me what the fraction is. We just have to make sure that we simplify it then. So how do we remember which way to move our decimal point between the decimal and the percent? There is a guy called Decimal Percent Man, and he is drawn out right here for you. If you're starting with a decimal, the D, you move 2 places to the right to make it a percent, and if you're at the percent, you move 2 places to the left to make it a decimal then. Decimal Percent Man, and there's his little mustache to kind of help remind you. Okay? Going back, percents are always going to compare numbers to 100, and if you think about on your test, getting a perfect on your test would be a 100%. Percents can also be bigger than 100%, but less than 1%. So if I asked you to write 1.2 as a percent, you're going to move your decimal point 2 places to the right, fill this in with a 0. This is really 120%. In this one, write 7 thousandths as a percent. If I think about my place value, this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths. If I have 7 thousandths, that would go right here in this spot, and those would both be zeros. That's the decimal form. This told me to change it to a percent. Decimal Percent Man reminds me to go from a decimal to a percent, move it 2 places to the right. So boom, boom. It's in front of the 7, so 0.7%. The last actual learning part of our lesson prior to practicing is going ahead and putting decimals, percents, and fractions in order when we have them all together. So in this set of numbers, I have 34%, 0.38, 1/4, and 2. We're ordering from least to greatest. Before we can start to compare these, they all have to be in the same form. The form that I'm going to go to is a decimal because it's easy to change all of these to decimals. 34% move your decimal point 2 places left, you have 0.34. 0.38 is already there. 1/4, I'm going to use my calculator, and that's going to switch it over to 0.25. If you think about that as 1/4, it's worth 25 cents. And 2 is also in decimal form. So looking from least to greatest, 2 is clearly going to be my biggest. That's going to go at the very end. In order to compare decimals, it helps if they all have the same number of digits after the decimal. 2 digits, 2 digits, 2 digits. If it doesn't have that, we might have to add a 0 onto the end so that they are all able to be compared. So really I can look at just 34, 38, and 25. 25 is the smallest, so I'm going to put 0.25. Once I do that, I either cross it off or check it in some way. After 0.25, I'm going to go with 0.34, and then 0.38, and then finally 2. There were 4 pieces to start. I have 4 pieces in my answer, but I'm not done because this is not how they originally presented. 0.25 was presented as 1/4. 0.34 was presented as 34%. 0.38 was 0.38, and 2 was 2. This is actually your final answer. If I take these 4, I'm going to work down here. 55% is 0.55. 0.72 is already there. 1/2, I'm going to use my calculator, that's 0.5, and 0.54. Since they're all decimals, do they all have 2 digits after the decimal point? Hopefully you're looking at this one. It does not. So we need to add a 0 onto the end so that we can actually compare them all easily. In this case, this is the smallest, so the 0.50, followed by the 0.54, followed by the 0.55, and ending it out with the 0.72. Again, not my final answer though. 0.50 was given to me as 1/2. This was 0.54. This was 55%. And this was 0.72. So this is my final answer. The next page is practice. So what I'm going to have you do is pause the video, do the first line of problems 1, 2, and 3 of writing decimals as percents, and then I'll have you come back and check your answers in the video. So go ahead and pause, work on those first 3 problems here, and then come back to check your answers. Go ahead and take a look at your first 3 answers, 39%, 0.56%, and 900%. Pause the video, do the next row. You'll notice here that we can't jump straight from fractions to percents, so I first changed everything to a decimal and then decimals to a percent. Once you've checked your answers, pause the video and then do the next line. There you go, check your answers. In this one, you do not need the extra 0 behind there. This one confuses a lot of people. This one is a percentage to start because of the percent sign, so you have to move your decimal place 2 places to the left still to make it back to a decimal. Do the last row and go ahead and check your answers. Again, for most of these, I change them into decimals first and then put them into fraction form. That's the end of the lesson.